Welcome to the Senior Techie podcast. Um, Most of us think Memorial Day started with, a presidential decree or maybe some formal act of Congress in the 20th century.
Right. Or we just associate it with mattress sales and neighborhood barbecues.
Yeah, exactly. Just the unofficial kickoff to summer. But the real story, the true origin of this day, it actually began in May 1865 at a former Confederate prison camp.
And it was led by thousands of newly freed Black Americans, which is just incredible.
It really is. So today, we are not just walking through a history lesson. We are embarking on an investigative deep dive together.
Yes, because just as those citizens preserved history in 1865, you are entirely capable of using modern technology to uncover and protect your own family's military history this weekend.
Absolutely. And it's something we focus on a lot in the community at the Senior Techie, using these digital tools not to replace our physical traditions, but to really deeply enrich them.
It is the perfect weekend to take that journey.
Yeah.
Because technology, especially digital archiving, it can sometimes feel overwhelming, like it requires a computer science degree to navigate.
Oh, totally. I hear that all the time.
But the reality is quite the opposite. When we approach these tools with intention, they act as a bridge. They allow us to connect with our past, to answer questions our families have debated for decades, and to honor those we have lost.
Right.
So the goal today is to demystify the mechanics of that technology so you feel completely empowered to use it yourself.
I love that. And to truly appreciate the power of preserving these memories today, we have to start by understanding how easily history can just be lost.
Yet, it's fragile.
It really is. Just as we are going to act as digital detectives for our own families, historians have had to act as detectives to uncover the roots of Memorial Day. We have to look at Charleston, South Carolina in May 1865.
Right after the Civil War had ended.
Exactly, only weeks prior, the city was in ruins. And at the Washington Race Course, which was a former jockey club converted into a Confederate prison camp, the conditions had been unimaginably brutal.
257 Union soldiers died there.
Yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting. Their treatment upon death was just as bleak. They had been buried in a mass, unmarked grave behind the grandstand.
It was a tragic situation, completely devoid of dignity.
It's awful.
But the historical record shows that a remarkable group of people refused to let that indignity stand. Thousands of formerly enslaved Black residents of Charleston took it upon themselves to change the narrative.
Wow.
Over a period of weeks, they went to that grim site and meticulously exhumed and reinterred those 257 men, giving them proper individual burials.
I mean, the physical labor required for that is just staggering. They essentially built a new cemetery from scratch.
They did. They constructed a high whitewashed fence around the graves to protect them, and they built an archway over the entrance that read, Martyrs of the Racecourse.
That's amazing.
Then, on May 1st, 1865, they held a massive parade. Nearly 10,000 people participated.
1,000 in 1865.
Yeah, led by 3,000 Black children singing hymns and carrying armfuls of roses to cover the newly formed graves.
Wow.
The historian David Blight from Yale University, who brought this story back to the public consciousness, points to this as one of the earliest, if not the earliest, widespread Memorial Day observances in American history.
What strikes me about that story is the sheer scale of the event. 10,000 witnesses, a massive parade. And yet, for over a century, that story was essentially erased from the national consciousness.
It was almost completely forgotten.
How does an event with that much physical footprint just vanish from the history books?
Well, it vanishes because history is incredibly fragile when it relies only on shifting societal narratives. During the Reconstruction era, the national narrative prioritized reconciliation between the North and South, often at the direct expense of the Black Americans who had championed the Union cause.
So the story just didn't fit the new narrative.
Exactly, so it was actively marginalized. Blight only rediscovered it because he was digging through a messy physical archive at Harvard University and found a primary source.
Like a journal or something.
A handwritten narrative by a Union veteran who witnessed it. That single piece of fragile paper is what survived the erasure.
Which highlights exactly why preserving our own family records is so critical. If we don't actively protect the narrative, time simply washes it away.
Very true.
But before we get into the technology of how we preserve these things, we should trace how that solemn observance in Charleston evolved into the long weekend we experience today.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how the evolution reveals a profound psychological shift in the country. For a very long time, the observance wasn't known as Memorial Day at all. It was called Decoration Day.
Decoration Day.
Yeah.
Because of the flowers.
Exactly. The primary activity was highly localized. Families and communities went out and physically decorated soldiers' graves with flowers and flags. It was a visceral, physical act of mourning. The federal government didn't even officially adopt the name Memorial Day until 1967.
Which always surprises people. We tend to assume it was coined by Abraham Lincoln or something, but 1967 was practically yesterday in historical terms.
It really was.
And then just 4 years later, the entire structure of the holiday changed again.
Right. In 1971, Congress passed the Uniform Monday Holiday Act. The explicit goal was to create a convenient 3-day weekend for American workers by moving the observance to the last Monday in May.
Ah, so that's when the shift happened.
Yep. From a legislative standpoint, it was a success, but it fundamentally altered the psychology of the holiday. By attaching it to a long weekend at the onset of warm weather, it naturally morphed into a season opener. A weekend for leisure, travel, and retail, rather than a dedicated day of remembrance.
I think we all feel that tension, right? There is a desire to enjoy the extra day off with our families, but there is also a lingering sense that the day demands a heavier reflection. And that tension often leads to a very common confusion. I hear well-meaning people thanking living veterans for their service on Memorial Day, treating it as interchangeable with Veterans Day. We need to clearly define the boundary between the two.
It is an understandable overlap, but the boundary is incredibly strict and deeply important. Memorial Day is specifically and exclusively reserved for honoring United States military members who died in service to their country.
Right. It's a day of mourning.
Exactly. Veterans Day, which we observe in November, is designated to honor everyone who has served in the military, living or deceased. Both days are vital, but Memorial Day carries a very specific, solemn weight that should not be diluted.
Memorial Day is for those who did not come home. With that understanding anchoring us, it is time to pivot to the investigative part of our deep dive.
Let's do it.
How do we actually find the records of these specific individuals? I want to push back on the typical advice here, because last year I tried looking up my great-uncle's service records online.
And how did that go?
I was immediately hit with technical jargon about searching an index database and using OCR. For many in our audience, that jargon acts as a massive stop sign. It feels like our own family data is locked behind a foreign language.
The jargon is absolutely the barrier, not the technology itself.
Right.
We need to break down the mechanics of how digital archiving actually works, because once you understand the mechanism, the intimidation completely vanishes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's define the digital landscape before we get into the weeds. When people hear things like URL or web address...
Right, the string of letters at the top of the screen.
Exactly. Think of a URL as simply the exact street address of a building, except this building lives inside your computer. If you have the address, you can walk right through the front door.
I love that. And when you hear database or online archive,
What's the best way to visualize that?
think of it like a gigantic magical filing cabinet. Instead of walking down endless rows of dusty drawers, you just whisper a person's name, and their exact file flies right into your hand.
That sounds a lot less intimidating than indexed relational server. And what about digitizing? We hear, I need to digitize my photos.
How would you describe it?
I'd say digitizing is like taking a fragile, yellowing photograph and sealing it inside an indestructible block of clear glass. Once it's digitized, it will never fade, and you can instantly mail copies to your grandchildren without ever visiting the post office.
That's a perfect analogy. So now that we have the vocabulary mastered, it's time to open that magical filing cabinet and search for those loved ones.
Where do we even start? I know there are a lot of commercial sites that charge hefty subscription fees.
Your first stop should always be the official government tools, because they are free, reliable, and incredibly comprehensive. The Department of Veterans Affairs operates the VA National Grave Locator.
And what's the address for that?
It's gravlocator.cmm.va.gov. This tool lets you search for any veteran buried in a national cemetery, state veteran cemetery, and many other military burial grounds. You type in a name, and it instantly tells you their exact resting place.
And if we want to find the actual service records, not just the burial location, like discharge papers.
For the documents, you turn to the National Archives. Their street address, going back to our analogy, is archives.govveterans. Now, a quick point of friction to be aware of: some records you can view for free, while others require you to submit a formal records request, which might have a small fee.
Right, but just the amount you can see for free from your kitchen table is staggering.
It really is.
Beyond the government sites, the community-driven tools are incredibly powerful. like findagrave.com, which is actually owned by Ancestry now, and they hold over 230 million memorial pages.
Yeah, that's a massive resource.
And there is also fold3.com, which is a massive archive specifically focused on military records. Sometimes they even open up their paywalled records for free access during Memorial Day weekend. But I have a fundamental question about this entire digital process.
Let's hear it.
If my grandfather is buried in a small cemetery in rural Pennsylvania and I am sitting at my desk in California looking at a glowing screen, doesn't that inherently create distance? I mean, does this digital mechanism actually bring us closer to the people we lost, or does it just reduce their memory to data points?
That's a really valid fear. If it were purely algorithmic data, it would undoubtedly feel cold. But the brilliance of a platform like Find a Grave is the human element driving it.
The human element.
Yes. Find a Grave is largely maintained by unpaid volunteers. If you locate your grandfather's record in that Pennsylvania cemetery, but you cannot physically travel there, you can literally click a button to request a photograph of his specific headstone.
Wait, and a volunteer on the other end actually receives that request?
Yes. A stranger, someone who happens to live near that rural Pennsylvania cemetery, receives a notification. That person will willingly get in their car, drive to the cemetery, walk the rows until they locate your grandfather's specific marker, and take a clear, respectful photograph.
That is just incredible.
They do it simply to help a grieving stranger across the country. And they upload it for you, often within days, entirely for free.
There's something incredibly profound about a stranger giving up their Saturday afternoon to walk a cemetery for someone they have never met. It completely shatters the idea that the internet only fosters isolation.
Right. It's a quiet act of kindness that the internet actually got right.
So what does this all mean? It means you have the power to do this right now. We encourage you to pick just one name this weekend. It could be a relative or even a name from a local war memorial in your hometown.
Yes, take 15 minutes.
Run that name through the VA locator or Find a Grave, or simply do a Google search with their name and the phrase military service. Let the databases do the heavy lifting. The discoveries waiting for you are truly remarkable.
That covers looking outward into the public archives. But we also need to look inward at the artifacts you might already possess.
Oh, like the physical shoebox under the bed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A fragile photo album in the closet. A handwritten letter from basic training. How do we protect those physical items before time degrades them entirely?
Well, we digitize them, put them in that indestructible block of glass. But I assume you need some fancy computer scanner for that.
Not at all. You do not need to go to an electronics store and purchase a bulky, complicated flatbed scanner. You possess a vastly superior tool right now, the camera on your smartphone.
Really? Just a regular camera?
Yes, but you use specific apps. Both Google Photos and Apple Photos, or even the built-in Notes app on an iPhone, have document scanning features engineered specifically for preservation.
Let's explain the mechanics of that, because it is not the same as just pointing your camera and taking a standard photo, which usually results in, terrible glare and crooked edges.
It is completely different.
Well, yeah.
When you activate the document scanner feature, the software uses advanced contrast detection. It finds the four corners of the document, virtually flattens the image out, and strips away the shadows.
That directly ties into the core philosophy we champion here. You already hold the capability to do this. You do not need to hire an expensive professional archivist. You can take that fragile 60-year-old photograph, place it in good lighting, and lock it into digital permanence on your own.
And once it is scanned, it becomes immune to time.
We've discussed searching the past and preserving the physical artifacts in our homes. Before we wrap up this deep dive, let's look at how we can use our technology to participate in a shared present-day moment of honor.
Right.
Because there is a specific Memorial Day tradition that suffers from a massive lack of public awareness.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, there is a glaring omission in how our country collectively observes the day. In the year 2000, the United States Congress passed a resolution establishing the National Moment of Remembrance.
What does that entail exactly?
This resolution formally asks all Americans, wherever they are, to pause for a 1-minute moment of silence at exactly 3 p.m. local time on Memorial Day.
3 p.m. local time. Yet, despite being a congressional resolution for over 2 decades, it gets almost zero media coverage. You won't see television commercials about it. For most of us, 3 p.m. rolls around, we're busy managing the grill, and the moment just vanishes.
The intention behind the resolution was beautiful. A specific minute where the entire nation stops to acknowledge the staggering cost of our freedoms. But human memory is fallible.
which is where a very modern application of our everyday technology can solve the problem. I challenge you, the listener. Grab your smartphone right now, open your clock or alarm application, and set a reminder for 3 p.m. this coming Monday.
Yes, label it remembrance.
It takes 10 seconds. It requires zero technical expertise. But by setting that digital trigger, you guarantee that this profound moment will not pass you by. You can put down the spatula, excuse yourself from the conversation, and take 60 seconds to ground yourself.
It is a micro habit of remembrance. We spend so much time discussing how our phones distract us. This is a chance to use the alarm in your pocket to forcefully return you to the present.
Exactly. It perfectly encapsulates why we bother learning these digital tools. We learn them to deepen our human experience.
This raises an important question, though, to leave you with as we move into the weekend. We often hear that the internet is driving us apart or erasing our history in a flood of fast-moving information.
Right, that's the common fear.
But when we look at volunteers photographing graves for strangers, or digital archives rescuing the names of the 257 Union soldiers honored in 1865, we have to ask, is it possible that technology, when used with intention, is actually the greatest tool for quiet remembrance humanity has ever built?
That is a fascinating and deeply sobering thought to mull over. Thank you for walking through this deep dive with us today. This podcast was brought to you by The Senior Techie. It's available on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. If you'd like to receive their free newsletters, you can subscribe at subscribe.theseniortechie.com.